What if the car you've been saving up for suddenly costs thousands more, simply because of a political clash over steel, borders, and global supply lines? Picture stepping into your local dealership, ready to test drive a brand new SUV or family sedan, only to realize the sticker price has jumped by a shocking margin. You might assume market forces or fancy upgrades caused the spike, but the real story runs far deeper. Welcome to a world where once stable trade deals have been upended by tariffs and retaliatory measures, and where America's ties to Canada and Mexico hang in the balance. We're about to dive into the hidden side of car manufacturing, unraveling the decades-long network of global partners supplying everything from steel frames to microchips. Some say the push for American-made cars is long overdue, while others warn it could sabotage an entire industry and hit your wallet in ways you've never imagined. By the end, you'll see why a single government policy can trigger chaos for automakers, workers, and families, potentially risking jobs, fueling inflation, and leaving all of us stuck with bigger bills. Cars might seem like simple machines. You hop in, turn the ignition, and go. But building them is anything but simple. From the seat cushions to the engine, thousands of parts come together, often from different corners of the planet. While a vehicle might carry a badge from Ford, GM, or Toyota, that doesn't mean every piece was born in the same place. In fact, your American SUV could contain steel mined in Canada, electronics assembled in Korea, and engines partially machined in Mexico. This global tapestry isn't a recent invention. It evolved over decades as automakers sought cheaper components, specialized labor, and efficient distribution routes. Free trade agreements, like NAFTA, and later the USMCA, helped knit these networks together, allowing parts to cross borders quickly without sky-high duties. Many people never realized how crucial these cross-border links were until politicians started questioning them. The reason it works so seamlessly, at least until recently, is straightforward. Automakers want to reduce costs. Splitting production tasks among different countries where materials, labor, or expertise are more affordable helps keep the final sticker price from skyrocketing. Yet, one sudden shift in tariffs or border taxes can send shockwaves through the entire chain. A small fee on steel or semiconductors cascades through assembly lines, hiking up the cost of each finished car. And that's precisely where controversy rears its head. National leaders eyeing quick fixes or protective measures often turn to tariffs, believing higher import taxes will magically draw manufacturing back home. But behind the scenes, executives frantically crunch numbers and rethink supply routes, knowing that each newly taxed part could choke their profits and weigh heavily on everyday consumers. The phrase, "America First," became a political lightning rod when former President Donald Trump took office. His administration argued that foreign metal imports undercut U.S. producers, leading to factory closures and job cuts in American steel towns. So he imposed tariffs, sometimes as high as 25%, on steel and aluminum imports from nations once considered close allies. At first glance, the idea seemed straightforward. Make these foreign materials more expensive, thus protecting U.S. steel mills and aluminum smelters. In theory, American automakers would buy domestic metal, boosting local jobs. But the auto industry isn't a neat, self-contained ecosystem. Parts flow across borders in a continuous loop, from raw ore to refined metal to car frames. Every time a piece crosses a boundary, import taxes can come into play. Economists were quick to warn of unintended consequences. If steel or aluminum costs surged, wouldn't that ripple directly into final car prices? And if cars got more expensive, wouldn't sales slow, eventually harming the very factories these tariffs were supposed to protect? Critics highlighted past attempts, like President George W. Bush's steel tariffs in 2002, that backfired, leading to job losses in steel-dependent industries. Still, the Trump administration pressed on. Supporters claimed it was time to rebuild the U.S. manufacturing core, reduce reliance on foreign supplies, and force global suppliers to negotiate better deals. For a while, the debate felt abstract, until families looking for new vehicles started noticing higher quotes on dealership lots. Think of car manufacturing as a massive assembly line stretched across national borders. If steel from Canada or Mexico suddenly carries a 25% surcharge, that extra cost doesn't vanish. It gets passed down the line from part suppliers to automakers to dealerships, and finally, to you, the buyer. Even a modest fee on engine components or electronic modules can mean an extra few $100s per vehicle. Multiply those increases by all the parts that make up a modern car, And the final price tag can swell by thousands. SUVs, pickup trucks, and commercial vehicles feel the brunt the most because they consume more metal. A standard sedan might require fewer heavy components, but a large SUV or truck needs robust frames, chassis, and bigger engines. Each of these subassemblies might cross borders multiple times during production, racking up import duties at every turn. By the time the vehicle is assembled in Michigan, Ohio, or Kentucky, the price can balloon well beyond what buyers had expected. This isn't just a headache for big corporations, it's a gut punch for families on tight budgets. If you'd planned to stretch your finances for a $35,000 vehicle, learning that it now costs $38,000 or $39,000 could derail your plans. Maybe you delay your purchase for a year or opt for a used model instead. As more consumers back off, dealerships face slumping demand, potentially leading to unsold inventory, and that in turn triggers production cutbacks at plants, risking layoffs or hour reductions. It's a domino effect. Rising material costs reduce consumer demand, spooking the entire supply chain. No one emerges unscathed, except perhaps the few domestic metal producers who briefly see profit boosts. But the surprises didn't end there. America's crucial neighbors, Canada and Mexico, had their own ideas about how to respond to the tariff threat. Canada is a giant in the resource world, supplying raw materials like iron ore, aluminum, and oil to U.S. industries. For decades, trade agreements ensured these materials flowed smoothly across the border, fueling America's car factories. But when the Trump administration branded Canadian metal imports a national security risk, tensions boiled over. Canada retaliated with tariffs on selected U.S. goods, signaling it wouldn't be a passive bystander. Meanwhile, Mexico's role in the North American car supply chain has exploded since the 1990s. Factories in states like Guanajuato and Nuevo León churn out engines, transmissions, wiring harnesses, and countless other parts that end up in U.S.-branded cars. Brands like Ford, GM, and Chrysler have major production lines south of the border, thanks to cheaper labor and favorable trade rules. Slapping a 25% duty on entire vehicles made in Mexico would upend a system that's been running for decades. Unsurprisingly, Mexican leaders warned that if Washington targeted their exports, they'd strike back against American goods. Some officials suggested heavy duties on U.S. agricultural products, a key export to Mexico. Others vowed to target iconic brands. This tit-for-tat environment worried economists who saw potential for a full-blown trade war that could wreak havoc on both economies. Auto executives were caught in the crossfire, struggling to plan for an uncertain future. Should they shift production lines to the U.S. and risk massive capital expenditures? Or wait out the political storm, hoping cooler heads would eventually prevail? While corporate strategists weighed these dilemmas, regular Americans braced for something even more personal, an attack on their monthly budgets. If a new SUV or pickup's price spikes by $2,000, $3,000, or even $5,000, the direct impact hits families. Many rely on monthly car payments that are already tight, especially if they're juggling other expenses like housing, healthcare, or education. That extra cost can be a deal breaker. It's not a small inconvenience. For some, it's the difference between reliable transportation and clinging to an aging, less efficient vehicle for a few more years. Dealerships also suffer. Inventories back up when shoppers stay away, forcing dealers to offer bigger discounts or take losses just to move vehicles off the lot. When dealerships can't clear stock, they reduce orders from factories, triggering a wave of cutbacks. Assembly plants might start by trimming overtime hours, then move to layoffs if sales remain stagnant. It doesn't take long for entire communities built around auto plants to feel the pain. Meanwhile, consumer spending power shrinks. People who might have purchased new appliances or gone on vacations direct more of their funds to inflated car payments, or they opt out entirely. This slowdown can seep into other parts of the economy, creating the very conditions that could tip us toward a recession. The Federal Reserve has repeatedly flagged tariffs as an inflation risk, meaning if car prices surge, it might raise interest rates. That makes mortgages and credit card debt more expensive, further squeezing household budgets. Some ask, are these sacrifices worth it if it means revitalizing domestic industries? The answer isn't so clear. When automakers rely on foreign-sourced parts for efficiency, forcing them to switch to local suppliers can take years of factory building, worker training, and supply chain restructuring. It's like telling a finely tuned machine to rebuild itself mid-operation. And as if that weren't complicated enough, there's another storm cloud looming on the horizon: the race to produce electric vehicles, EVs. As climate concerns mount, nearly every major car company is pivoting toward electric vehicles. Tesla led the charge, but stalwarts like GM, Ford, Toyota, and Volkswagen are all investing heavily to ramp up EV production. These vehicles promise fewer emissions, lower fuel costs, and a futuristic driving experience. Yet they also depend on highly specialized components, especially batteries laden with rare metals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, much of which is mined or processed overseas. So what happens if the US slaps tariffs on these crucial materials or the parts built from them? Prices for electric cars could shoot through the roof, stalling widespread adoption. Governments might offer tax incentives to offset those costs, but it becomes a cat-and-mouse game. One policy driving up prices, another policy attempting to bring them back down. Automakers worry that too many conflicting measures will keep EVs unaffordable for the average consumer, slowing the transition away from fossil fuels. Tesla, for instance, heavily relies on global supply chains for its batteries. While it's building gigafactories in the US, some raw materials still come from abroad, requiring shipping, processing, and assembly steps that span continents. If each step faces a potential tariff, the cost of Tesla's vehicles could climb, and the brand might lose the competitive edge that made it the poster child of EV innovation. The same is true for other companies racing to launch electric trucks and SUVs, models that use even more metal and battery capacity. A big part of selling EVs is convincing consumers they'll save money on fuel in the long run. But if the initial purchase price becomes astronomical, that selling point loses its punch. The question becomes, are policymakers aware of how tariffs might sabotage America's green ambitions? Or are we repeating old strategies, hoping for different results? The notion that tariffs might fix the auto industry harks back to earlier administrations, from Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush. Each had reasons to impose trade barriers, often under the banner of national security or protecting American jobs. The outcome rarely matched the hype. In the 1970s and 1980s, Japanese and European automakers gained a reputation for efficiency and quality, expanding their market share even as the US tried to shield domestic producers. Tariffs or voluntary restraint agreements often encourage foreign companies to establish plants in the US, which ironically made them seem more local. Under President George W. Bush, steel tariffs aimed to boost American mills but ended up hurting industries that depended on affordable steel, from construction to auto parts. Critics argue that history offers a clear lesson. Protective tariffs might help a niche group, but they usually backfire on the broader economy, driving up prices and stifling competition. Today, the world is even more interconnected. If an automaker can't efficiently import engine blocks from Mexico, it may retool a factory in the US, but not without massive upfront costs, regulatory hurdles, and months or years before production ramps up. Meanwhile, car prices climb, and consumers are left in the lurch. Some believe it's a price worth paying to regain industrial independence. Others see it as an unnecessary step backward, especially given the proven benefits of cross-border specialization. If anything, the pressures are greater now than in the past, thanks to the accelerated push for advanced technologies, the global race for battery dominance, and widespread inflation fears. Add in the fact that Canada, Mexico, and other trading partners can also retaliate, and you have a recipe for a trade storm that could dwarf earlier skirmishes. So will these tariffs become a permanent fixture of American policy, or are they more of a short-term maneuver to gain negotiating leverage? The truth is, it's anyone's guess. Industry lobbyists are tirelessly pressing Congress to weigh the broader impact on consumers, while some politicians see tariffs as a winning platform to rally voters who feel left behind by globalization. In the short term, we could see manufacturers quietly raise prices to cover new costs. Consumers might not notice the cause if it's buried in the final sticker. Over time, however, the hikes become impossible to ignore, especially if they add thousands of dollars to already high vehicle costs. That's when you might see the Federal Reserve step in with comments about inflation and interest rates, or hear about strategic deals struck at the 11th hour to prevent an all-out trade war. One potential curveball is how technology might reshape production. With rapid advancements in automation, 3D printing, and alternative materials, some automakers might find ways to bypass traditional supply chains. If they can build more parts locally through high-tech processes, the tariff threat loses some of its bite. Still, These solutions are years from widespread adoption, and they require immense capital that not every company can muster. There's also the possibility that Canada and Mexico decide to focus on other markets if the US keeps moving the goalposts. They might forge stronger ties with the European Union, Japan, or China, diversifying their export strategies. That would challenge America's long-held position as the prime destination for North American auto parts. Meanwhile, the U.S. consumer base could shrink if economic headwinds intensify, deepening the industry's uncertainty. In other words, we're at a crossroads. The outcome depends on a swirl of economic data, political ambitions, and international relations. Will the U.S. auto sector adapt in time to avoid higher production costs, or will the entire supply chain start cracking under pressure? We're witnessing a historic turning point for the U.S. auto industry, and the stakes couldn't be higher. On one side, you have the argument for protecting American jobs by slapping tariffs on imported metals and parts. On the other, you have a global machine that's thrived on cross-border collaboration, driving down costs and spurring innovation. Add the complexities of electric vehicle production, environmental targets, and intensifying global competition, and it's clear this isn't just about paying a bit more for a new truck or sedan. Tariffs may offer a short-term jolt of nationalism, but history suggests that in an industry as sprawling and interlinked as auto manufacturing, they're more likely to spark price hikes, reduce consumer demand, and potentially cost jobs rather than save them. Canada and Mexico aren't small-time players. They're pivotal partners whose cooperation has fueled decades of automobile breakthroughs. Fraying those bonds could leave American firms scrambling to rebuild from scratch, a process that takes enormous time and money, ultimately leading to higher prices in showrooms and lost opportunities in innovation labs. Is there a path that balances national interests with global cooperation? Many economists believe so, but it requires carefully negotiated trade deals that consider how deeply cars are woven into multinational supply chains. Slapping broad tariffs on metals and finished vehicles might be a quick headline grabber, but it often leads to a cycle of retaliation and economic damage that's tough to reverse. What do you think? Should the U.S. double down on tariffs to force automakers back home? Or is that a recipe for disaster? Are we truly on the cusp of reigniting our manufacturing prowess? Or are we risking the entire auto industry's stability for a short-lived political gain? Let us know in the comments. If you found this video enlightening, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next deep dive into the shifting world of automotive tech, evolving trade deals, and the shocking controversies still waiting to unfold. Thanks for watching, and buckle up. The road ahead for America's cars is about to get a whole lot bumpier.